إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Okay, before I start on the lecture today, I just want to go back to the topic because there's a question by Brother Kotaiba on the concept of invisible hand. So basically, when we talk about invisible hand, it goes back to Adam Smith. All right. So here. So Adam Smith's theory is that in economics, everyone would act in their own self-interest, and when everyone acts in their own self-interest, their actions will cause an outcome that is for the greater good of the society. Okay, so everyone will have a good outcome, and this outcome is basically translated in the form of equilibrium. Right. So if you look at, for example, the concept of supply and demand. Okay, so here, okay, so we have the demand, we have price here, we have quantity here, and this is the demand curve. Okay, and this is the supply curve. So what Adam Smith says is that if, let's say, the price in the market is at this point.
Doctor,
sorry,
I can't
see
any.
I haven't shared the screen. Sorry. Thank you for reminding me. Can you see it now?
Yes, I can see now.
Okay. So let me just repeat that. Okay. So we have the market, right? Market is where the suppliers and the consumers interact with each other. Okay. So in the market, we have prices, and we have the quantity of goods and services that are sold. Okay. And then we have the demand of consumers, D here, and then we have the supply from the suppliers, from the producers. Okay. And Adam Smith says, basically, let's say one type of good in the market is at this price. Okay, so this is P1. Okay, so at P1, the quantity that is supplied is here. Okay, so quantity supply. Okay, and the quantity that is demanded is here, quantity demanded. Okay, so at P1, basically the quantity that people demand is more than the quantity that is supplied in the market. Okay, so what happens here is that there will be a shortage of goods and services. Okay, so if you go to the market, for example, let's say this is the chicken market, and the price of chicken is at P1, and at P1, basically the number of suppliers that the number of quantity that suppliers are willing to supply is only here because the price is too low. Okay, and the number of quantity that is demanded by consumers is high because the price is low, so people will demand more. So what happens is that this is a shortage, so there will be a shortage. Okay, so when we go to go back to the points here, right, where profit-seeking producers will want to make more. Okay, and then if there is the need of society that would want to be met, and government that is not involved, and then competition keeps quality high, competition keeps prices low. Okay, and then what happens is that, okay, so this is, I think, the key concept here in terms of invisible hand is the concept of self-interest. Okay, so concept of self-interest will say basically suppliers that are supplying here, they will not increase their supply if the price remains at P1. Okay, so only if the price goes up will they increase the number of supplies, right? So if the price goes to here, the quantity will be here, right? And similarly, for people who are demanding for the chicken, for example, they will then, in order for them to get the chicken, what they will do, okay, from the perspective of a buyer, right? From the perspective of a buyer, so they will demand. So what they will do is that they will bid up the price. So the original price, let's say, is P1. So now they will bid up the price. So when they bid up the price will move up higher. Okay, so when from P1, let's say now it is here P2. Okay, P2 is here. So but still at P2 there will be a shortage of demand. Okay, and then they will bid up further the price because they want to get the quantity that they want, and eventually the price will be at the equilibrium where the supply and demand meets. Okay, so essentially what happens is that, okay, this movement of prices happens automatically from the behavior of the producer and from the behavior of the consumer. So there is no government intervention. Okay, so the movement here, the movement of the prices and the quantity here that happens automatically because of everyone's self-interest is termed the invisible hand, right? So there's no government intervention, but the movement of price and quantity in the market, okay, so sometimes price goes up, sometimes price goes down, and this up and down movement, if there is no government intervention, the question is who moves this price, right? Who moves this price? So Adam Smith says the invisible hand moves this price. Okay, so because everyone is self-interested, and their behavior is based on their own self-interest, so when they act on that self-interest, the movement of the price and quantity will be moved supposedly by an invisible hand that we cannot see, right? So this is opposed to government intervention. So if the government intervenes, for example, the government can set, okay, the price of chicken is too high, so we will set the maximum price to be at P1, at this blue line. So you cannot increase the price higher than this blue line, and this basically is a form of government intervention. And when government intervenes, basically government sets the price of the good, right? So when this happens, there will be a shortage, and that shortage is not an optimum outcome, right? So Adam Smith says, if the government doesn't intervene and everyone acts on their own self-interest, then that is the best outcome, where the equilibrium will happen. And the movement of this is basically, the movement of price and quantity is basically the invisible hand. Right? So hopefully that answers the question. Yeah, Brother Kutaiba?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Doctor.
Okay, anyone else have any questions related to the topics that we have discussed previously? Or any questions related to the assignment or anything? Okay, so in that case, I'll just continue with the slides for today. Yeah? So the slides are available here. Okay, so today we will cover an introduction of macroeconomics. Okay, macroeconomics. So you can download the slides there. But let me just share the screen. Okay, so can you see the slides? Introduction to macroeconomics. Can you see it? Someone tell me. Okay.
Yes, doctor.
Okay, so basically for the previous classes, all of the topics that we covered was so previously we covered micro. Okay, so the difference is just the I and the A. Okay, so for today we will go into macro. Okay, so so basically for today I'll try to cover introduction of macroeconomics, and then we'll look at some concept of macroeconomics related to performances and policies, and then savings and investments, and then finally uncertainty, expectations, and shocks. Okay, so before I present, I would want to get your thoughts on what is macroeconomics. Okay, so let me just pull out the randomizer here. And then just ask, what are your thoughts on macroeconomics? Okay, so who will the randomizer call? Okay, Brother Bayo. Are you there, Brother Bayo?
Yes,
Yeah.
Doctor.
So what are your thoughts on macroeconomics? What is the difference with microeconomics?
Macroeconomics is when it is related to the government, like the economy.
So micro is not related to government.
No, it's related to individuals.
Individuals. Okay. Okay.
Like it's when we study the economy like entirely, not just for a specific purpose.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. So we'll just get another person to share their thoughts as well. Oh, you're lucky again. Sister Sundus, what are your thoughts on macroeconomics? What is macroeconomics?
The study of economy as a whole.
So micro doesn't study economics as a whole.
It's just as individual.
Individual.
How company makes decisions.
So for macro, they don't look at the individuals and companies.
They look as a whole.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. So let's ask another person. Why is it important to understand macroeconomics? Brother Sulaiman. Are you there, Brother Sulaiman?
Yeah, I'm there.
Why do you think it's important to understand macroeconomics?
Micro or macro?
Macro.
Maybe because it is more larger than in terms of.
Yeah. So what's the benefit of learning about larger economics? What's the benefit? Can you think of any benefits?
Learning more about the economics. To learn more about the economics.
How about in terms of the application? What application can you think of in terms of the real world?
What type of
application? How do we apply the knowledge of macroeconomics in the real world?
Yeah, we applied it at a large scale. Like
any examples?
Like for instance, want, like apply economy system for the whole.
You can think of any, maybe after this, inshallah. Okay, so thank you. So it's just just for you to get that curiosity going, okay, and hopefully by the end of the class, the answers to these questions are more clear, inshallah. Okay, thank you for sharing. Okay, so let me just continue. Okay, so I think Sister Sundus mentioned the keyword just now in terms of economy as a whole. Okay, so that's I think a keyword that is very much related to macro. Okay, the whole. Okay, so when we look at macroeconomics, okay, usually the focus is on national economics. Okay, national economies. Okay, and they seek to answer the larger economic questions. Okay, and we still look at behavior. Previously, we looked at individual behaviors, at firms' behaviors, right? Supply and demand. But now we look at behavior and performance of an economy as a whole. Okay, so when we talk about whole, okay, and we look at what are the variables or what are the applications, we basically relate this to applications like production of a country, right? And then growth of a country. Okay, so and then employment in the country, and then what are the prices in the country, right? So these are all the general things that happen in the economy of a certain country, right? So when you zoom into the separate sections of the economy, then it is looking at the micro, right? So if you have, for example, if you have a map, right, or a jigsaw puzzle, and there are sections on the map, right? So when they come together, they form the shape, for example, right? So that is the bigger picture of the map or a country, for example. But if you zoom into a certain state, like say here, so then it is more looking at the micro part of the state. Okay, so that's the you can say one of the distinguishing features between micro and microeconomics. Okay, so one aspect of macroeconomics is looking at performance and policy of a country. Okay, performance and policy of a country, and this is usually looked into in terms of is analyzed based on the time period. Okay, so usually when you want to look at the performance and policy, there is the performance of a country in the long run and the performance in the short run. Okay, so usually there is a distinction on how you analyze performance and policy. Okay, so in economics, usually when we say short run, it is usually less than 1 year. Okay, short run is usually referred to less than 1 year. Above or more than 1 year, that is the long run. Okay, so you can analyze different things in the short run and in the long run. For example, we can analyze output and also employment. Okay, so output here, when we talk about output, usually it refers to gross domestic product. Right, so this is a very important term that we will study, GDP, gross domestic product. Okay, so the output that is being produced in a country during a year or within a quarter is termed the GDP. Okay, so you can look at the output in the short run or in the long run. Okay, so usually in economics, they separate the time period in a year into 4 quarters. Okay, there is quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4. Okay, so this is usually 1 year. Okay, so basically then if you separate 1 year, or you divide 1 year into 4 quadrants, each quadrant is 3 months. Okay, so 3 months plus 3 plus 3 plus 3, then you make it, it becomes 12 months, right? So that's 1 year. So usually if you want to look at the performance or the effect of a policy, you can look at it in the short run. You can analyze per quarter. Okay, you can see, okay, quarter 1, what was the performance? Quarter 2, what was the performance? Quarter 3, what was the performance? And then quarter 4, what was the performance? And then if you look at it for more than 1 year, then it is more of a long run. Okay, so you can have the GDP numbers in quarter 1, GDP numbers quarter 2, right? And also employment numbers quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is related to macroeconomics. Okay, and then another aspect, when we talk about the short run or in the long run, okay, we have usually when it comes to GDP, the output, we have fluctuations. It always happens, the fluctuations, and these fluctuations are referred to business cycle. Okay, business cycle. So this is also an important term to know and understand. Okay, so basically this chart here, okay, this chart here represents the business cycle of a country. So no matter what country, based on the current economic system that we are currently operating in, if you look at the trend and the performance over a long run period, they will have a business cycle pattern. Okay, so the business cycle pattern is where we have, no matter what country, even in US, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, usually they follow the similar pattern, where in the economy there will be an expansion. Okay, so the expansion is where the economy grows. So the GDP grows. The real GDP grows, and then it will reach a peak. It will reach a peak, but after the peak, the economy will go back down. So that is usually the term that is being used as a recession, and then up to a certain point where it reaches its minimum, and the term that is being used is a trough, and then after you reach the minimum, it will expand back again. Okay, and then this cycle will continue again and again. Okay, so usually if you look at the global economy, the world economy, this happens every 10 years. Okay, more or less 10 to 15 years, there will be a recession. Okay, so in the previous period, you can probably remember the period of global financial crisis. Okay, so the GFC. Okay, so the global financial crisis, you can say, happened around 2009, 2010. Okay, and so this is basically around 10 to 11 years ago. Okay, and currently we have experienced the recession, right? So from COVID, but COVID, it was argued that COVID only made the recession worse. Okay, we were already facing a recession. Even without COVID, we were already facing a global recession. And basically when COVID happened, the recession dipped down further. Okay, but now we have already, I think now we are in the period of trough, and currently the countries globally are experiencing a expansion. Okay, and the last time this happened was in back in 2010 during the global financial crisis, where we encountered a recession, and then we experienced the recovery and expansion, and then in 2020 we experienced the recession again. Okay, and also in regions in ASEAN, we also 10 years before the global financial crisis, right, at around 1998, 1997, okay, in Malaysia we experienced the ASEAN financial crisis. Okay, so that was around 97, 98. Okay, so you can argue that global financial crisis also start around 2007, 2008. Okay, and the recession was felt globally in 2010. But generally, you can see that the business cycle happen at around 10 years, they will happen again. Okay, so this is some papers have argued that this is because of the credit creation system, and we'll look at it later on, I think in later topics, where especially happening through debt and also money creation. So because of that, we will always be experiencing a business cycle. Okay, so it goes up and then go down, up and down. So usually the trend is around 10 years. Okay.
Doctor, is it necessary? It must go. It must go down and up like this always after every 10 years, or
Yeah.
is it necessary?
This is the trend. This is the trend. If you open the
Okay, it cannot stay at one place like this.
Yeah, it will always happen.
Okay.
This is based on the data that we have so far. Okay. So this is the term, the business cycle. So when times are good, you always have to prepare that the bad times will happen after that. Okay. So this is just something that yeah, I think in our lifetime, this has happened a few times already. Okay, and if you look at the trend, going back to when people were starting to analyze the GDP, they saw the trend of going up and down. Okay, but if you chart a straight line, it in the long run, basically it goes at a higher trend in terms of the real GDP. The long run, although there will be fluctuations, but it always goes up because of the better conditions that we are in. Okay, so if you look at the history of humanity, the civilization that we have evolved from, okay, we are of course better off as compared to previous civilizations. Okay, in terms of our output and our well-being. Okay, so that's just something that it's good for you to be aware of. Okay, and here are some of the different measures that are used by economists to evaluate the performance when it comes to macroeconomic data. Okay, so when we want to see the economy as a whole, usually these are the things that we refer to. What is the data that we refer to? We usually refer to GDP, and in GDP we have real GDP and nominal GDP. Okay, so basically nominal GDP is, it uses the current prices, but real GDP uses current prices that is corrected with price changes. Okay, and this is basically corrected with inflation. Okay, so this basically real GDP is the more accurate measure. Okay, more accurate measure, because when you, for example, refer to the price of a chicken, right? Maybe last year the price of the chicken was $10, but this year it is $15. Okay, so the price of the chicken went up, and when you consider the output in terms of nominal GDP, okay, so from $10, the price goes up to $15. Right? So if you count it from the perspective of nominal GDP, this is a good thing, because now we have produced more in terms of the amount. Okay, when in actual fact it's still one chicken, right? So real GDP basically corrects this inflation. Okay, inflation is where the price of goods and services goes up, right? So then they will correct and show what is the actual measure of value in terms of the goods and services that is being produced. Okay, so we'll see the calculation later on. Okay, so it's just now is just for you to be aware of, these are the measurements or the variables that people refer to when it comes to macroeconomic data. Okay, so the nominal GDP and real GDP, and then we also refer to unemployment level. So this is also an important measure. Basically, unemployment is the number of people that are willing, okay, people who are willing and able to work but cannot find employment. Okay, so if you are willing and you are able to work but you cannot find employment, then you are part of the unemployment figure. Okay, so the concept is that basically if there are people like this, if there are people who are unemployed, it means that basically the economy is not utilizing its resources efficiently. So it is unutilized. Okay, so you have the skills, you have the labor, but the labor is unutilized. Okay, so basically unemployment is something that is not desirable for the economy. Okay, so this is also something that we refer to. Okay, so especially when you see during recessions, you can see that unemployment levels are usually high. Okay, so so that's the another key data. And then another aspect is inflation. Okay, so inflation is also a data that we target or we look at when it comes to macroeconomics. Okay, so why are these data or variables important? Is because usually these are the data that the government or the central bank target. Okay, so usually there is a target that the government sets. Okay, so for example, let's say the real GDP for this year is 100 billion. So next year we want to target 120 billion. Okay, so that is the target. How do we then achieve this target? So usually the governments will then come up with policies. Okay, government will come up with policies to increase the GDP, for example. Okay, or for example, the government targets unemployment level now is, let's say, 5%. So next year we want to target only 3%. So how do we close the gap? So there must be some policies to close the gap. Okay, so similarly, in terms of inflation, usually inflation is targeted by the central bank. So the central bank targets, let's say this year is 6% inflation. Now we want to target next year 3%. So what do we do? Okay, so then they will usually undertake monetary policy. Okay, so central bank will undertake monetary policy. For the government, they will undertake fiscal policy to achieve the targets. Okay, so this fiscal and monetary policy we will cover later on, inshallah. Okay, so for the government, yeah, I mentioned just now in terms of targeting. So for example, the government wants to target a certain number in terms of GDP. So the government then has to come up with policies on answering these questions. Okay, how do we promote the economic growth in order to achieve this target? Okay, or we are facing a recession because based on the business cycle, based on the data that we are currently looking at, we are on a downward trajectory. Okay, so for example, based on the current trend, because you can estimate, yeah, based on the data, right? So usually the government will have the available data, and let's say currently, based on the trend that we are looking at, this is the expected trend. Okay, so the expected trend is that the economy will go down. Okay, and then it will recover again. Okay, so let's say, how do we come up with policies instead of it going to the green dots? How do we minimize the recession? So we make it into the blue dots. Okay, so that's reducing the severity of recessions. Right, so there are various ways that the government can undertake through the policies that they have. Okay, so one of the policies that they undertake is the fiscal policy. Okay, so we will cover fiscal policy later on. Okay, and if you look at basically, maybe you can refer to, if you started your assignments already, right? How governments reacted to the impending or the environment of recession that happened because of COVID. Okay? So they undertook, if you realize, various monetary or fiscal policies that was effective to mitigate recessions. Okay, so for example, if you realize, many governments undertook measures like cash transfer, where the government gave money to its citizens. It gave money to its citizens in order to mitigate the recession. Okay, or the central bank basically printed more money and gave it to the banks so that the banks can give it out as loan. Right, so that's also part of the mitigation strategy, and that's a monetary policy. Okay, and then there is also the question in terms of macroeconomics, right? Looking at this question, usually when you want to target a certain variable, most of the time there is a trade-off. Okay, for example, here the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay, so because the theory goes, if let's say, if unemployment, this is just theory, and you can probably argue it's also logical. If unemployment is low, more people have wages and money. Okay, so when unemployment low, people have jobs, people have more money. So when people have jobs and people have more money, what happens is that prices would go up. Right, so this is inflation. Okay, so the trade-off here, based on this idea, is that if you want to have low unemployment, you would then have to sacrifice prices, right? Or if you want to target inflation, for example, you want to target prices to be low, so low inflation, then one way is that this can happen if people have less money and have less wages. So this is when unemployment is high. So basically the idea is that if you want to target, you cannot target both. So you have to either target unemployment levels or target price. Okay, so you can there are policies that target both, but how do you find the right balance between inflation and unemployment? So that's something that most governments and most policymakers have to find the right balance. Okay, so this is related to macroeconomics. Okay, and then another question when it comes to performance and policy is whether the market can react to anticipated or unanticipated government policy. Okay, so there are, for example, when the government announces a certain economic policy and people are not surprised by it, so that's anticipated. So then people can adjust their behavior based on that anticipation. Okay, but there are certain times where government announces something and people do not anticipate it, so it comes with a surprise. Okay, so that is usually a shock to the market. So when a shock happens, maybe the outcome is good, but also there are certain times where the outcome is not good. So you have to also balance it. For example, if you are part of the government, you have to have an effective way of communicating the government policy. Okay, so that's also would affect the performance in the country. Okay, so here just some examples in terms of the numbers that we look at when it comes to macroeconomics. Okay, so here we are referring to the US. Okay, so for example, the US output growth or GDP growth from 1995 to 2007 is around 2.7%. Okay, on average. So what this means is that if, for example, the output is 100 billion for this year, the next year it is 102. Okay, 102.7. Okay, and then the next year it will increase 2.7% again. Okay, so that is all just a number that we look at when we want to refer to the policies. Okay, and this is important because for example, for GDP, we can compare with other countries because everyone uses the same measurement. So if, for example, if US, you can compare with the UK, and then you can see, okay, US is 2.7%, how much is UK, and why are they experiencing better growth, for example. So then you can see, okay, what are the policies that they use. Okay, and then the next one here, another example in terms of unemployment rate. Okay, so in 2015, the US unemployment is 5.3%. Okay, so what this means is that in the labor force, okay, let's say there are 100 people that want to work and able to work. However, only 95 people are able to find a job. So the 5 people are not working. Okay, so these 5 people is the unemployment. Okay, so they are part of the unemployment. So in 2005, unemployment rate in Greece is 25%, South Korea 3.6, France 10.4, Haiti is 40.6. Okay, so it's easy to compare with other countries as well. Okay, so because other countries also target unemployment rate. Okay, another example is inflation. Okay, so inflation in 2015 US is very low, 0.1%. So what this means is that if there is an item that is sold for $100, okay, the next year it is $100.01. So this is the inflation rate in 2015. Okay, in Norway it was 2.2%, Kenya 6.6%, Venezuela 121%. Okay, and Mexico 2.7%. So it's different inflation rates in different countries. Okay, yeah, so one of the places that you can find this data is the World Bank. Okay, so there is World Bank or IMF or CIA. CIA also they have the website. Okay, so if you look at the trend of Malaysia and you look at the figure of the graph, right, it is a business cycle. So it is going down, going up, going down, going up, going down, going up, yeah, going down, going up again. So it is at around 10 years. Okay? in 2010, and then 2000 also we had that as well. So the data goes back only until 1984. Okay, but you can see other. Yeah, so this is 2020. So if you look at the data, if you look at the graph, it is basically a business cycle. Okay, maybe we can see US. So United States is the green one. So similar trend. How about South Africa, for example? Yeah, and if you look, yeah, it's a similar trend. Yeah, and then you can compare between all the different countries. Okay, but this is in terms of percentage, yeah, in terms of growth. But the point here is that the shape of the graph is similar. The shape of the graph is similar no matter what country. Okay, and this is basically you can argue is because all the economies around the world is interconnected with each other, and it is primarily influenced by the most influential economy, and currently it is United States. Okay, but however, if you look at the influence of China, it is slowly taking away the influence, right? So basically from the past 30 to 50 years, the saying goes that if the United States sneezes, the whole world will catch a cold, right? United States sneezes, the whole world will catch a cold, meaning to say that whatever happens to the economy of the United States, the other economies around the world will have the same effect. So that's what happens, right? But if you look at China, maybe the trend is a bit different. Okay. See, if you look at China, the trend is a bit different because they are in some way independent of the United States. Okay, but if you look at the trend in terms of going down in 2020, I think all the countries around the world is the same. Can we see the world data? So the world is basically following the United States. Okay, so it's something interesting if you want to explore. You can see in the World Bank website. Okay.
Doctor, the numbers here, what does they mean?
It is the percentage of GDP growth. Percentage. It doesn't mean the size. It's just a percentage. For example, United States, let's say the output of the United States is 1 trillion. So the trend is that, okay, in 2004, it increased 3.7%, 3.8%. So there was a growth from 1 trillion to 1.03 trillion. So it's not absolute. So for Malaysia, let's say for Malaysia, maybe the GDP is 100 billion, but US is 1 trillion. But this is just representing the percentage in terms of the growth of the progress of the GDP. Okay, so this is in terms of percentage. Okay, if you want to look at the real GDP, we can find the real GDP. Okay, so you can compare Malaysia, so see this is the real numbers. Okay, so United States is 20.95 trillion, Malaysia is 337.1 billion. Okay, but in terms of the growth, in terms of percentage, okay, these are the numbers. Do you understand?
Yes, doctor.
Okay, so there are this is basically percentage. If you want to compare the absolute, of course United States is much bigger. Okay, but this is not a good comparison because of course United States has a higher GDP number because of the size of the country, the population, the technology. So you cannot compare the progress easily. Okay, so it's better to look at what is the difference from the last year. So you can see that from the growth rate in terms of the percentage here. Okay, so you can compare. Okay. Yeah, so this is basically part of the macroeconomic data that we can analyze, right? So you can see GDP, you can see maybe unemployment. Okay, so unemployment, Malaysia and United States, yeah. So in terms of unemployment levels, you can see that Malaysia is doing much better. So it's now 4.5, but United States is 8%. So 8 out of 100 people in United States that are willing and are able to work, they cannot find work. Okay, so it is important to have that two criteria, the willing and able. So if you are not willing and you are not able, then you are not part of the labor force. Okay, so the labor force is for people who are willing, they want to work and they are able to work. So if you want to work but you're not able to work, for example, if you you encountered into a car accident and you are disabled, you want to work but you cannot work because you cannot travel, you cannot do the physical activities, so that you are considered not part of the labor force. Okay, so basically the unemployed person is, he wants to work, he is able to work, but he cannot find a work. Okay, so that is basically the statistic there. Okay, so for United States, 8 out of 100 people cannot find work. For Malaysia, 4.5 out of 100 people cannot find work. Okay, so this is the latest in 2020. Okay, now I think it has been updated, but they haven't updated yet. Okay.
Doctor, so you can. But this, all of these are estimations, right?
This is real data.
Real data.
Yeah.
Like how would they know that? Would they count people or what?
Okay. So this is the next slide. Okay. So if you look at this 2020, this is usually the real data, but they based on the data and available data, they also do the estimation. But whatever is shown here is the real data because this is the previous years. Okay. So based on the available data, they can also do an estimation. Okay. So let me just show you the next slide. Okay. So for example here, so these are from various websites. So for Malaysia, the organization or the institution that counts the people or does the survey is basically the Department of Statistics. Okay, so I think in different countries they may have different names for this institution, but basically there will be an institution that figures out or finds out what is the data for each GDP, unemployment, inflation. Okay, so in Malaysia we have the Department of Statistics, and I think, oh, this is actually not the latest one. Let's see the latest one. Labor market. Yeah, so in the website they have different indicators. Okay, they have different statistics, and what they usually do is that they undertake massive survey, and from the survey they can come up with the data. Okay, yeah, so this is the latest one, February 2022. February 2022 in Malaysia. So currently, based on the data that they know they have, we have a labor force of 16.4 million. 16.4 million out of our population is around 32 million. Okay, so 32, so around half of our population in Malaysia are in the labor force. Okay, so the remaining are people who, who are children, who are not yet who are not yet graduated. Right? So those are not considered part of the labor force. Okay, so people who have graduated, people who are able and willing, they are part of the labor force. So the labor force, based on the statistic, is around 16.4 million. Okay, and based out of the 16.4 million, the data shows that 15.73 million are employed. So how do they know this? They basically ask the employers. They ask the employers, how many people are working in your company? Right? How many jobs do you have? How many people? And they gather all this data. Okay, and basically the number of unemployed is 4.1% out of the labor force. So that is 671,000 are unemployed. Okay, so there are then they break it down to actively unemployed, inactively unemployed. So these are people who are looking for a job but cannot find a job, but there are some people who are currently not looking for a job. Okay, and these are, outside labor force are people who are students, who are stay-at-home parents, stay-at-home people, elderly. So these are people outside of the labor force. Okay. So how do they find out? Basically, they undertake what is called the labor force survey. Okay, so they conduct and collect information from various sources, and then they gather it together, and then they come up with the statistics. Okay, so in here they also show the definitions. Okay, and then they explain here. Okay, so for different countries, usually they will have different institutions. Okay, maybe different names, and then they will show the statistics, and they can break it down up to monthly. Okay, so here is the monthly statistics. Each month they will undertake the survey and count how many people. Okay, and then you can see the trend. Okay, so all of it is on the website. For Malaysia, we have the Department of Statistics. Okay, and then here also they explain how they undertake the labor force survey. Okay, so here, based on the standard guidelines of International Labour Organization. So this is how they undertake the survey. Okay, so I think most of the countries will use the same guideline and standard from the ILO. Okay. Yeah, so this is one of the websites, okay, that you can look at. Okay. Okay, and then I also wanted to highlight, this is old news, but you can also, based on the data, based on the situation and environment and anticipation, some organizations can also anticipate or predict what is the outcome of the statistics for each GDP, unemployment, and inflation, right? So for example, here, the news I'm highlighting here, during COVID, there is an organization called the Malaysian Employers Federation. They estimate based on the data, unemployment could reach 2 million, okay, which is around 13%. Okay, and this is higher than the central bank's expectation of 4%. And MEF, I attended their presentation on why they estimated this, and basically they say, if the government doesn't undertake this policy, this will happen. Okay, so eventually the government did undertake the policies, and of course because of that, the unemployment level did not hit 13%. Okay, so it is basically there are some models and predictions that can be made based on the data. Okay, yeah, and then here also they break it down. Basically, here Khazanah Research Institute is saying that work for young people who just graduated from university is getting harder. Okay, so the unemployment level for younger people is much higher as compared to older people. Okay, and then here, for example, this is the example of government policy where they set up National Employment Council to focus on creating 500,000 jobs. So this is part of the government policy, because government wants to reduce unemployment. What can the government do? So they can come up with these policies, right? So in case of Malaysia, during this pandemic, they set up this. I think this was already an existing council, but this council then focus on creating the jobs. Okay, so how can they do that? Maybe they can provide subsidies, they can provide training, right? So there's various ways on undertaking these targets. Okay, so this is just an example of unemployment. Okay, but basically I want to highlight this as well, because although many countries have statistics for unemployment, but this is, I think, a statistic that is very much neglected or not given priority, whereby it is also important actually to look at the numbers of underemployment. Okay, so underemployment is the term used for people who are employed, who have a job, but their job does not match their qualification. Okay, so the example here, okay, so here is saying labor force productivity is underutilized. For example, an engineering graduate who is working as a sales agent, or a marine biologist who is working as an insurance agent, a law graduate that is working as an e-hailing driver, or master's graduate as an insurance agent. So what this means is that these people have high qualification, but they are working in jobs that do not require their qualifications. Okay, so this is basically termed as underemployed, whereby their skills does not match the jobs that they are currently doing. Okay, so in Malaysia, they had some statistics, I think a few times, but they do not. The Department of Statistics did not consistently report this. Okay, but one of the here I've taken the screenshot of one of the reports of underemployment in 2021. So the statistics basically show that people who yeah, this is on the right side. People who are underemployed in Malaysia, the statistics show that it is around 40% of the labor force. Okay, skill in terms of the skill-related underemployment, meaning to say that the economy is not providing high-quality jobs that match the skills and qualification of the graduates. Okay, so this is something that I think in other countries as well is something that we should be aware of and should come up with policies that can address this situation. Okay, because this is quite worrying. Because, for example, if you graduate from the university and then you cannot find a job, and finally you end up becoming a e-hailing driver. Okay, and this is basically a job that does not require your qualification, and you have invested your time and money to come up or obtain the degree or master's degree or PhD, for example, but eventually you are doing things that do not require you to use the skills that you have obtained. Okay, so this is, you can argue that it is a waste of time and money. Okay, because you could have not, you could have chosen not to continue your masters, for example, and just straight away go for e-hailing. Right, so that's something that has to be made aware, especially for governments. Right, so they have to address this issue. Okay, because it is a wastage of resources if this continues to happen. Okay, so you have to come up with policies to ensure that underemployment can be reduced as well. Okay, yeah. Any questions before I move to the next part? Okay. Okay, so now in terms of growth, another important aspect. Okay, if you look at this data and statistics for modern economic growth, you can argue that the rapid and sustained growth only happened after Industrial Revolution. So this was back in the 1700s. Okay, in Europe, in the West. Right, so 1700s. But prior to this, we do not have the data, and arguably because of the standard of living before the Industrial Revolution globally was quite low. Okay, and after that we started to measure the data. Okay, and after this period, we saw output per person increase, but however, not all countries experienced this, and we saw countries that grew or progressed much rapidly as compared to other countries, and eventually there were classifications of countries where the more modern or that grew faster were the industrial countries as compared to countries that were still remaining in the agricultural sector. Okay? And another argument is that actually why some countries were growing faster is because they were taking away from other countries. For example, the European countries, they were going to other countries and colonizing the countries and taking away the valuable resources. Right, so countries like in Africa, even in Asia, Malaysia also experienced this, where we were colonized, and these colonizers from Europe took away our valuable resources to build their own country. So therefore, they grew more rapidly, and their standard of living became better than these countries that they colonized. Right. So this is also a factor that we have to be aware of. Okay? When we talk about developing countries, developed countries in the current year or the current era, there are historical reasons why this happened. And one of the reasons, undeniably, is because these developed countries, they came to the developing countries or to the poor countries, and they took away all the resources to build their own countries. Right? So now they are developed, and other countries are developing or still poor because of this. Okay. So now, yeah, at the global perspective, you can see in terms of GDP per person. Okay, so one way of comparing countries in terms of the growth is looking at the GDP per person. Basically, you look at the whole population, you look at the whole GDP, and you divide by the population, the number of population. Okay, so in 2014, so this was data in 2014, Switzerland was the highest. Okay, but in 2020, Luxembourg. Okay, so you can see the data here as well in terms of GDP per capita. Okay. GDP per person or GDP per capita would show the GDP over the country. But you can see basically the difference here is very stark, because you look at Switzerland, for example, GDP per person is 58,171 compared to Burundi. Right? Burundi is only 865. Right, so it's very stark in terms of the output per person. Okay. The link is not working somehow. Yeah, so here is the data from IMF. Yeah, so if you click the link, you can see the European and Western countries in green. Okay, and they are doing much better than, for example, the African and South American countries. And you can argue that it's because they went to these countries and took away the resources. Okay. Yeah, so this is just the map that represents the wealth per person, okay, or the output per person that we can compare. Okay. So you can also go to the IMF website. So previously it is World Bank. This one is IMF. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, this one I wanted to highlight in terms of the world's largest economy.
Please,
Yes.
I want to clarify something about this GDP. Is it that we are counting a country's economic growth or countries' population growth? Or which one are we actually?
We can count both, right? For example, here. Okay, so this is a good opportunity for me to show you. Okay, for example, if you look at, this is the size of GDP. Size of GDP is represented by the circle. Okay, so for example, United States, the size of the GDP of the country as a whole is 25.35 thousand in terms of billion. So this is 25 trillion. And China is 19.91 trillion. Okay.
So is this economic growth or population growth? Which one is it?
No, this is the output of a country, and we will go through how we calculate GDP later. So, but GDP is basically how much, in terms of the value of goods and services, does a country produce within the year. So in 1 year, United States produces goods and services. So gross domestic product, what product do they produce? Okay, the value of the things that they produce is 25 trillion here. China produces 20 trillion. Okay, so when we produce, for example, if I produce and I sell, the income that I get is around, for example, if I'm China, I produce and sell, the income I get is around 20 trillion. Okay, so you can think about it from that perspective as well, because there are different ways to measure GDP. One way is through the income, or how much is the value of the goods that you produce. Okay, so this is basically showing how much are we producing, the value. Okay, so in terms of the largest economy currently, in terms of the size, you can see the circle here, United States and China, two of the largest economies in the world. Okay, however, we cannot fairly compare the contribution based on this, because we know they are big countries, right? So in order for us to know fairly, we then have to divide by the number of people. then we know GDP per capita. Okay, GDP per capita. So in terms of GDP of each country, we know, okay, this is a lot. But what is actually GDP per capita? So you can think about it from the perspective of for each person, how much do they get in terms of the income? For example, if China, the income of China is 20 trillion, let's say. But how much do each person get? So you can then look at, let's see if IMF has it, GDP per capita. So GDP per capita means GDP per person. Okay, so GDP per capita in China is 14.1 thousand on average. 14.1 thousand. So each person has around, or income of each person is around 14.1 thousand per year. Okay, so that's the average. Okay, of course, some people may earn higher, some people may earn lower. Okay, but this is the average. If you calculate the total GDP over population, you will get GDP per capita. Okay, so for United States, it is 76.03 thousand per person. Okay, so this is a fairer comparison when you want to see how much each person in the country gets. Okay, so you can play around with this as well. I think.
So, Doctor, this is like about the salary or the services.
We will go through GDP later, but there are different ways of calculating GDP. But you can understand it. Maybe you can look at it from the perspective of a producer, right? If you have a business and you produce, let's say a product, let's say you produce a mobile phone. You have a factory that produces mobile phones, and each mobile phone is, let's say, $100, and for that year you produce 1,000 mobile phones. So the total value that you produce during that year is $100 times 1,000, right? So that is your output. That is the product. In terms of the value you produce is $100,000. Do you get me? You understand?
Yes, doctor.
Yes.
So that's one way of looking at it, of what are you producing. So basically GDP is then calculates all the product that is produced in that country during that year. So they look at all the factories, all the businesses. What are you producing? What is the number? Right? So where do they get the number? You get it from the annual report, for example. What is your revenue? Right? What is your profit? So then you can add all these numbers together to get the GDP of the country. So who does this? Usually it is the Department of Statistics that come up with the calculation. Here, if we have the GDP per capita. Not coming up. Okay, but we will cover GDP later. Okay, we will have one, I think one class just on how we calculate GDP. Okay. Yeah, but you can explore this first. It's not coming up. Okay, but basically here is just GDP per capita is you calculate what is the output of the overall economy, and then you divide by each person. So you just try to imagine this is how much we produce, or this is how much the income that the whole country gets, and if we divide the income and give it fairly to everyone the same, okay, this is how much everyone gets. Okay, but of course there is a very big difference between the people who earn more and earn less. Okay, earn the most and earn the less. Okay, because we have to take into account the gap between the rich and the poor as well. But this is just basically if everyone produces or gets the same amount, this is the number in terms of GDP per capita. Okay. Yeah, so there is the GDP and GDP per capita. We will go on further detail later. Okay, on this. Okay. So just be aware of this first. Okay, just get to know and so for this lecture is just for you to be exposed to these figures first. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So some questions that you can think of. Okay. You can start to think of why are we so obsessed with looking at GDP, for example? Why are we so obsessed with growth? Okay. So because every year, if you look at statistics that is announced by the government or by the central bank of any country, they are always quoting GDP. Okay, what is the growth of GDP? This year is 5%. Last year was 3%. Next year, we estimate 6%. Okay, so we are so obsessed with growth. Okay, and then the next question that we can think of is, should we not measure growth? Maybe we can measure other things. Okay, maybe we can measure healthcare. Maybe we can measure education level. Maybe we can measure well-being. Maybe we can measure happiness. Okay, and there are countries that measure this. Okay, there are countries that measure this, and I think some statistics is also available. Let's try to see. Okay, so we have the GDP, but I think some data you can also see in terms of education. Do they have education? Health. Showing. So IMF and World Bank, I think they should have some level of education and healthcare, but I'm not sure why they're not showing here. Okay, so okay then we'll just continue. So this is just some questions that we can start to think about. Okay, although yes, it is important to measure growth, there are actually some other measures. Okay, because now I think when we want to talk about progress of a country, usually that is how we compare countries to one another. We look at the data in terms of GDP numbers, GDP percentage, inflation level, unemployment level. Okay, but there are other measures as well that we should be aware of. Okay, so this is something that you can think about. Okay. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. Okay, so another important aspect that we should be aware of when it comes to macroeconomics is the aspect of savings and investment. Okay, savings and investment. Okay, why? Because basically saving, you can argue, is a trade-off, current for future consumption, right? So for example, if you have a wage of 100, you get income of 100 and you save 50%, save and you spend 50. So basically, your spending is counted as consumption. Okay, so current consumption. The saving is what you will consume in the future. Okay, consumption in future. Okay, so why is this important? Because when it comes to GDP calculations, current consumption is important. Okay, because when you consume, when you buy things, it will be included in GDP calculation. Okay, and if you save, then the money is not being productive in the economy. Okay, so it doesn't contribute to GDP. So you want to be constantly consuming in order to contribute to the economy. Okay, and so this is one aspect in terms of savings. Another aspect is in terms of investment. So when businesses or an individual invest, okay, so sometimes the output or the results may not be immediate. Okay, so when you, for example, open a business and you spend to open a factory, so the factory maybe in the first year does not produce anything yet, so it's just to build the factory. So in that case, the output is not there. So only in the future can you see the output, right? So that's also an important aspect because it relates to, again, the calculation of GDP. Okay. Oh, I forgot actually. We can get to know GDP. So GDP, this is the important equation of GDP. How do we calculate GDP? We'll go into detail later on. But this is the important equation. Okay. So GDP is calculated by calculating consumption plus investment plus government spending, okay, plus exports minus imports. Okay, exports are the things that we sell, okay, we produce. Okay, for example, if Malaysia produces solar panels and we sell to United States, so that's exporting. And if Malaysia buys mobile phones from the United States, that's importing. Okay, so this is basically how GDP is calculated, by looking at these aspects. So the equation is basically C plus I plus G plus NX. NX here is net exports. Okay, exports minus imports is net exports. Okay, so this is the how we calculate the GDP. Okay, so we'll go through we'll touch on this in a later class, but it's something that you can start to be aware of. Okay, so basically, okay, so savings doesn't contribute to C. Okay, only when you consume you can contribute to C. Okay, and then investment, when you spend for investment, it contributes to I. And then there's also the role of the banks and financial institutions, whereby they provide loans. Okay, so when they provide loans, they can contribute to C and I as well, because businesses, when they go to banks and undertake investment, they will also contribute to I. Okay, and then it's also important to know or understand the difference between financial investment and economic investment. Okay, so financial investment are usually investments related to financial market. So this is related to things like bonds, money market, stocks. So this is financial investment, and usually this is not counted in GDP. Okay, and then another part is economic investment. So this is where you invest to produce machines, factories. So this is counted in GDP. Okay, so this is something that you have to be aware of as well. Okay, because essentially what matters is the real economy. So the real economy is the ones that is related to machines and factories that we can usually touch and feel. Okay, so this is another concept that is important under macroeconomics, the savings and investment. Okay, and then another concept that is related to macroeconomics is uncertainty, expectations, and shocks. Okay, so basically this is related to decisions and behavior. Okay, so if we experience uncertainty that is against what we expect, this will affect our decision making and our behavior. Okay, so especially when it comes to our consumption behavior, saving behavior, and investment behavior. Okay, so when we, for example, we were planning to let's say we were planning to expand our business or to open a business in 2020, but then something uncertain happened in the form of COVID. So that was a shock. So we had, for example, we already had some savings, let's say 5 million. We had 5 million and we wanted to open a business. So when we open a business, we were planning to invest. But because of the shock, now we do not open the business and we just leave it there. Okay, so that would affect our investment behavior or our decision to invest. Okay, so this will affect the economy as a whole. Okay, in terms of, for example, if we were planning to open the factory and produce things, okay, and this basically affects the supply shock. Okay, or if, let's say, because of COVID, people were planning to spend money, for example, on holidays, but now because of COVID, they did not spend, and therefore there was also a demand shock. So this will affect the economy as a whole. Okay, so if we draw the demand and supply of the economy as a whole, it's the same like the microeconomic shape. Okay, it's the same. So you still have the demand downward sloping and the supply upward sloping. We have the price and we have the quantity. Okay, price and quantity. So demand is here, supply is here. Okay, so if, let's say, we have a demand shock, what happens is that the demand curve will shift to the left. Okay, so here, for example, the quantity that was demanded previously was Q1, but because of demand shock, the quantity is Q2. Okay, so the quantity that is demanded reduces, and this will affect the GDP as a whole. Okay, so similarly, if you have supply shock, it will also reduce the supply. Okay, so previously the supply was here, but now the supply was here. Okay, so that's also things that will affect the output in the economy. Okay. Okay, so this is related to inelasticity. Okay, so we covered this previously. So in some cases, depending on the elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply, it may affect prices, but in some cases, prices will not change. Okay, so in cases where prices are flexible or elastic, so this is usually referred to elastic. Yeah, so this will affect the price. If there is a shock to the demand, prices will fall. Okay, and in some cases, however, when we look at the total revenue calculation, sales may remain unchanged because of the elasticity, because of the flexibility. Okay, however, in some cases where the prices are sticky, so this is usually inelastic. And where businesses maintain their inventory, so their output doesn't change. And when we calculate the total revenue, you can see the value in terms of the sales will change. And this will usually affect in terms of the business cycle shape. Okay, so this is usually the contributing factor when prices are sticky, when prices doesn't adjust. Okay. Yeah, so this is an example of flexible prices. If there is a demand shock where demand can go up or down. Okay, so if let's say the demand goes up, prices can adjust. Okay, so price will also adjust, and demand goes down, basically price goes down. Okay, but if in the case, so this is where flexible prices elastic. Okay, because prices can change easily. This is a situation where prices are inelastic. So it doesn't change because it's fixed, and another term that is being used is sticky prices. Sticky prices, because you cannot easily change the price. Okay, so no matter what the demand is, in the case of inelastic prices, the price will remain the same. Okay, so for example, in different sectors, they will have different sticky prices. Okay, and it will take some time before the prices will change. Okay, so here's some example. Coin-operated laundry machines, only after a few 46 months they will change the price. For newspapers, only after 30 months they will change the price. Okay, but for example, airline tickets, in 1 month they can change the price. Gasoline, in half a month they can change the price. So depending on the goods and services, the shocks that will be experienced will depend on the stickiness of the price or the elasticity of the price. Okay, so this is related to the price elasticity of demand that we covered previously. Okay, so basically in the general rule, when we look at the data or the statistics, many prices are sticky in the short run, meaning to say the prices do not change within the year. Okay, and because consumers prefer stable prices, and consumers, if the price change, it will affect their consumption behavior. And then secondly, firms also want to avoid price wars. So if one firm changes the price, other firms may also reduce the price to compete. So when everyone competes, the businesses will get less profit. Okay, so that's also a reason why they do not change prices in the short run. Okay, but after some time, because they want to maximize their returns, usually in the long run, businesses will start to change. Okay, so that's a concept that is related to shocks that will then affect the output and GDP. Okay, so we can probably relate this to what happened during the pandemic, where although there was a shock, but in the short run, prices of goods and services did not change much because the prices were sticky. But only after a certain time, businesses started to change the price, okay, depending on the shock in terms of the supply and the shock of the demand. Okay, so it can go up or go down. Okay, so yeah, so going back to the business cycle. Okay, going back to the business cycle. Okay, the business cycle go up and go down, right? So there are different theories on why the business cycle happens. Okay, so one of it is from an economist called Hyman Minksy. Okay, Hyman Minksy says that this business cycle happens because of bubbles. It will always happen. So Minksy says he believes that, based on the data and his theory, he says that it always happens because of asset price bubbles. Okay, asset price bubbles. For example, especially related to debt fuel speculation. Debt fueled speculation. So in other words, to simplify, it happens because banks give out cheap loans. Okay, so it's easy to obtain loans from the bank, and these loans will then push up asset prices, for example, property prices, because many people can easily obtain the loan, and developers, property developers know that people can easily obtain. So for example, the price of property previously was 500,000, but now because of the cheap loans, people can easily get the loans. Property developers can increase the price to 600,000, for example. And they know that people can still buy it because they can go to the bank and get the loan to buy the property. So eventually, this prices will become bigger and bigger. Okay, the prices will go higher and higher, like a bubble or a balloon. Okay, but eventually, you will realize when the prices go up, the asset prices go up, there will be a certain point where actually people cannot repay back the loan. Okay, because I earn a certain income and I go to the bank and I want to buy a 1 million property, when in actual fact I cannot easily repay the loan. Okay, so when this happens, the bubble will burst. And when the bubble bursts, people cannot repay the loan. It will affect the financial market. It will affect the banks, and then this will spill over into the economy as a whole. Okay, so during the period of growth, usually there will be an increase in asset prices. Okay, property prices will increase, but then when it reaches the peak, the bubble will burst and it will go back down. And this is caused by debt. Okay, and we'll look at this later on in terms of especially monetary policy, because debt is related very much to interest. Okay, and the institution that controls the interest is the central bank, because central bank can set the interest target, and all the commercial banks will then refer to the interest by the central bank. Okay, so usually in a business cycle, especially during a recovery, central bank will keep interest low. So when interest is low, people can then borrow money at a cheaper price. Okay, and that will fuel the speculation again and increase the asset price bubble. Okay, and based on this, Minksy says it will always happen. Okay, Minksy says the business cycle will happen. Okay, and closely related to this is what is mentioned here is the Austrian school of economy.
Doctor, why if the interest rate is low, the asset will increase? Why?
So if the interest is high, if you go to the bank and you borrow from the bank, you have to pay a high interest, right? So if you pay a high interest, you do not find it attractive to borrow from the bank. So usually you will decide, maybe I don't want to borrow from the bank. Okay, but if you go to the bank and the bank says, oh, interest is 1% only. If you borrow 1 million, you pay 1% interest only. Okay, so then, oh, I can borrow from the bank and I can borrow and use the money to buy houses. Okay, so then this will increase the demand for houses, for asset prices. Okay, so it's not only houses, but you can think of other assets as well, different assets. Okay, even including financial assets. Okay, so when loans are cheap, the financial or the asset prices in the economy will increase the price. Okay, because now everyone can go to the bank and buy a house, for example. So when everyone can go to the bank and buy a house, the price of the houses will also increase, right? Because it's a limited number of houses. So previously the developer sells it for 500,000, but now because they know that people will demand for the house, it's the same house, we can increase it to 600,000 because many people are demanding for it, right? So then for the same house, previously it was 500,000. Eventually the price goes to 800,000. Right, so but people who borrow from the bank are actually the people, eventually the people who cannot afford the loan also gets to get the loan. You understand or not? Previously he cannot go, when he went to the bank doesn't approve because he say, oh, based on your credit score you cannot get the loan. But now because of the cheap loan, and the banks allow for this, then the people who previously cannot get the loan now can get the loan. And eventually he realized, actually I cannot repay. Okay, and then he defaults on the loan, and then this will burst the bubble, okay, the price bubble. Okay, so if the interest is low, loans are cheaper to get or easier to get. But if the interest is high, then the cost of the loan is much higher. So when it is much higher, then asset prices will also be low. Okay, because you cannot go to the bank. People are less likely to go to the bank and borrow to buy assets because of the high interest. So if you go and borrow from the bank with, let's say, 10% interest, many people would rather not go borrow from the bank. Maybe they will change their behavior, and then we say, okay, we wait until the interest is low, then we borrow. And then when we borrow, we can buy the assets. Okay, but if interest is high, it's better to save money in the bank, right? If you save money in the bank, you can get the returns from the interest, right? So if the interest is low and you save money in the bank, then the interest returns is also quite low. So it's better to borrow. Okay. Hopefully that answers the question, brother. You get it?
Yeah, understood. Yes, that was the cause of the financial crisis in 2008, right?
Yeah, partially, because it is related to the mortgage-backed securities.
Yeah.
So they use the loans to package and sell to other financial institutions, and some of the loans that they package were bad loans, or they know that these people will not be able to repay the loans, and eventually it came through, and the asset price bubble happened and it popped. Okay, so that's related to the global financial crisis back in 2010. Okay, but if you realize also in before when COVID happened, there was also a price bubble actually. there was a price bubble in many countries, but it popped during after after COVID happened. Okay, so during the recession, but it didn't go down much. But you can see that actually prices were stagnant. So it didn't go down, but it didn't change. It didn't go up. Okay, so in normal situation, the prices would go up, but because of the recession, most of the asset prices either went down a bit or remain the same. Okay, so this is the situation, and you can try to see the statistics. Okay, during COVID. Okay. Yeah. So when the recessions happen, governments and central bank can undertake policies. Okay. So usually the policies that they undertake is to stimulate the economy. Okay. So they can use fiscal policy for the government and monetary policy for the central bank. Okay. So during global financial crisis, they use both. The monetary policy was used to influence the interest rate, change the interest rate to be low, so that people borrowed more and spend more. And then they also undertook, in the US, they undertook, the term here is quantitative easing. Okay, quantitative easing was basically central bank in the US is Federal Reserve. Okay, the Federal Reserve, they print money. The Federal Reserve print money. Okay, so now it's, of course, it's not physical money. Now it's all in the computer. So they print money and they pump the money to the financial institutions. So when the financial institutions, they have extra money, they provide more loans, or they invest in financial assets. So when, for example, if you are a bank, right, and then suddenly the central bank give you money, the central bank says you have to give this money as loan, or you invest in financial assets. So in US, every month they printed around, if not mistaken, around 10 billion USD to stimulate the economy. And this early on wasn't effective, but they continued doing it, I think around 2 years, almost 2 years. And that eventually helped the economy to survive and recover. Okay, so that's the policies that they undertook. Okay, so different countries and different governments.
But doctor, like we know that printing money, too much money will lead to inflation, right?
Yeah. So you have to go back to the definition of inflation. So inflation is when too much money chasing too few goods. Okay, so if there's too much money chasing too few goods, then it will cause inflation. But the issue here is that how much is too much, right? Because if the money that is circulating in the economy is not chasing these few goods, then inflation may still not happen. It will happen, but not at a very high rate. So if you produce money, but at the same time you produce the goods, you inject money, but at the same time goods and services are being produced, then this condition doesn't happen. Too much money chasing too few goods doesn't happen. Okay, so you must have a balance of how much money can you print, but at the same time how much goods can you produce as an output. Okay, and you have to also remember the difference between the money chasing physical goods or physical investments and money chasing financial assets. So in this case of quantitative easing, most of it goes to financial assets. So the inflation happens in the stock market, in the bond market, but it didn't happen in the goods and services, that the items that you buy in the supermarket, but it happened in the stock market. So the stock prices increase and the bond market increase. Right, so that's inflation, but increase in the financial asset, but not in the goods and services. So there was some inflation in that case, but there was very, very low inflation in the goods and services. Okay, and this is also related to people's behavior as well, because when people, although there was more money, they because of the expectation, people didn't change their spending behavior, so they still bought goods similar to during the recession. So they didn't change their behavior immediately. Like if you have more money, the logic is that if you have more money, you will spend more. But now you have more money, maybe I wouldn't spend yet because I don't know what will happen next year. I will save first. I'll spend similar to what I have been spending so far. And when things get better, I will increase my consumption. So that is why the inflation wasn't as worse during the global financial crisis. Okay, so it's only when too much money chasing few goods, then the inflation will happen. Okay, so that's the response after the global financial crisis. Okay, so that was the immediate response. But in the long run, the government must undertake a more structural solution on how to prevent this from happening. So that is related to the policies undertake. Okay. So these are some of the macroeconomic questions that we can think about. Okay, so maybe you go back and think about this. Okay, and we will discuss it next week, inshallah. Okay, so some questions, for example, why are some countries rich and why are poor? Okay, why do some countries enjoy high living standards while other countries remain stagnant? Okay, why do all the countries, even the richest and the richest country, go through the business cycle, the boom and the bust period? Okay, and then is there anything that the government can do to improve living standards or fight recessions? So these are some of the questions related to macroeconomics that you can start to think of. Okay, I think with that I end my presentation. Okay, is there any questions or any discussions that you want to share? Everyone okay? Okay.
Yes, doctor.
Okay, so that's just an introduction to macroeconomics, and we will inshallah go deeper to each section, especially in terms of GDP in the coming weeks, inshallah. Okay, so hopefully I've catalyzed your curiosity in terms of macroeconomics, and you can then start to think about the applications when you go through newspaper reports or there's a news on economy. Then you can start to link the concepts that you learned in class. Okay, so I think that's all for today. We end the class with tasbih kifarah and surah al-asr. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika asyhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Wal 'asri innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa salihati wa tawassaw bil haqq wa tawassaw bis sabr. Okay, thank you very much everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Amma ina ba su ka sani ba za ka san ko ni dan ina bane.